Obviously, we don't support terrorism, so don't commit terrorism. But there's a reason that people, I think, still talk about the industrial society and its future, because actually Kaczynski has hit on a few themes which other writers have done, but he does in quite a forceful way, identifying the entire industrial system as the problem, the entire industrial society is the problem, whereas other authors thought that it could be a matter of education. I'm thinking C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man actually is very much in the same vein, where man becomes just a material good, a fungible material good that is able to be manufactured at will, which is something that Kaczynski talks about in the Industrial Society. This is a problem, and C.S. Lewis thought it was a lack of proper education, which, I mean, maybe it is, but Kaczynski thinks that it's the entire civilization is doomed to do this, and therefore we need to overthrow it, which is really the central thesis, which is the very first paragraph of the very first page, which is quite famous, so I thought I'd just read it quickly to show us what he's aiming at. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. They have greatly increased the life expectancy of those of us who live in advanced countries, but they have destabilized society, have made life unfulfilling, have subjected human beings to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering in the third world, to physical suffering as well, and have inflicted severe damage on the natural world. The continued development of technology will worsen the situation. It will certainly subject human beings to greater indignities, inflict greater damage on the natural world, and will probably lead to greater social disruption and psychological suffering, and may lead to increased physical suffering even in advanced countries.
And that has aged very, very well, hasn't it? From 1995 to today.
I mean, he didn't see the internet as we see it, let alone social media as we see it. So he's not wrong, and if you're a believer in the man-made climate change narrative, you have to agree with him there as well. And so his proposed solution is nothing short of overthrowing the concept of industrial technological society entirely. He says, "We therefore advocate a revolution against the industrial system. The revolution may or may not make use of violence. It may be sudden or it may be a relatively gradual process spanning a few decades. This is not to be a political revolution. Its object is to overthrow not governments but the economic and technological basis of the present society," which is quite straightforward actually, but it's also incredibly far-reaching and I think very unlikely to happen.
Yes, I think pretty much everyone else involved in politics would be your opponent. You're making an enemy of every single political faction in the system.
Yes.
In doing that. And I think he was a little bit naive to think that he could actually enact any change in the first place.
Yeah. It obviously wasn't going to work. But as a diagnosis of the problems of modernity, he at least has one aspect of it fairly well worked out, I think. You know, I think he is right that the way technology is being incorporated into our daily lives is putting us on a path that is, I suppose you would call it unnatural, and this will have consequences. And so we're seeing this all the time.
But that's not necessarily something that is that much of a revelation or a good prediction, because we'd been so far removed from our own nature. Like, you could argue that the creation of the first city or settlement was when we truly moved away from our nature of hunting and gathering.
Yeah, but the first cities were very primitive. Right?
They were, of course, yeah.
There is a very tangible difference between like a medieval city and the modern industrial city. You know?
Oh, it's come a very, very long way in terms of technology, hasn't it?
Yeah. So anyway, Kaczynski bookends the industrial society with screeds against leftism. And I think
these are my... Sorry,
no, go on.
I was going to say that these are probably my favourite bits, and I think these are actually the parts where he is most on point.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I think this is why Kaczynski has become popular in just non-left-wing circles online, because he accurately diagnosed what a leftist is all the way back in 1995. He basically is saying these social justice warriors are a real problem. And because Kaczynski was a PhD mathematician, insanely intelligent, definitely autistic, and apparently butted heads with leftists constantly in academia, and that's why he left, if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Although I've not been doing any extracurricular bombing.
Good. And so the second chapter of this is called The Psychology of Modern Leftism, because Kaczynski is not interested in going through the philosophy of leftism. He, in fact, psychologizes them and says, look, it's always the same kind of person who is a leftist. I'll read a quote, in fact. He says, but what is leftism? During the first half of the 20th century, leftism could have been practically identified with socialism. Today, the movement is fragmented and not clear who can probably be called a leftist. When we speak of leftists in this article, we have in mind mainly socialists, collectivists, politically correct types, feminists, gay and disability activists, animal rights activists, and the like. But not everyone associated with one of these movements is a leftist. What we are trying to get at in discussing leftism is not so much a movement or an ideology as a psychological type, rather a collection of related types. Thus, what we mean by leftism will emerge more clearly in the course of our discussion, because he's talking specifically about the kind of... And the thing is, everyone knows what kind of person he's talking about.
Absolutely. And sort of following on from 1995 when he wrote this, there has been a lot of work in political psychology that has found that actually there are a lot of aspects of personality types, which personality types as well can be genetic. So there's a sort of very clear thread through everything in which you can understand the nature of a person based on you could go from the genetics to their personality to their politics, and then there's this very clear delineation between them, but there's clearly also a thread running through them at the same time. And you've got, for example, the things that Jordan Peterson points out, whereby he says things like, yes, high openness to experience might make you more of a leftist. Low conscientiousness, high neuroticism, which aren't exactly flattering things. It's basically being open-minded to a fault, lazy and neurotic.
Self-critical to a fault. And I tell you what, man, as the father of 4 kids, they definitely have innate dispositions that they are born with, and you spend a lot of time trying to mediate.
You don't even need to look at human beings to see this. You can look at
animals.
You can look at animals. I've had plenty of pets of the same breed, and they all have their own unique personalities. And so you can't say that they're necessarily socialized into it, because the pet owner has remained relatively static and in the way in which the dog is brought up, but yet their individuality, probably stemming from their genetics ultimately, informs how they behave.
I'm absolutely convinced that it is biological that children are born with a particular kind of disposition. Because I mean, like in my household, my kids have got wildly different temperaments. And it's like, okay, but you're from the same parents, living in the same household. You haven't been socialized any differently. The same rules have applied consistently. Why is this one drawing on the walls? Anyway, so Ted feels that the leftist exhibits the following negative character traits, which leads them to seek out leftism as an amelioration of their condition. So they have feelings of inferiority, they are over-socialized, and they lack engagement in what he calls the power process. He explains all of this, and we'll go through it shortly. So the next chapter is feelings of inferiority. And this is interesting because it's not just... Because most people, when they feel inferior, it's a temporary state of affairs. So you've met someone who's brilliant at painting or sculpting or whatever, and you're not very good at that thing, and so you're like, oh. But then I think you go away and you feel normal again. But that's not the position of the modern leftist, in his opinion.
Yeah, the healthy perspective of that is actually excitement, because you can learn something from a person who's better at something than you are. And you shouldn't necessarily take it as being a negative thing. I actually really quite enjoy it, because it means, oh wow, not only is this good for me to be around this person, they can teach me some stuff, but also it's humbling. It keeps your ego in check, which is always a helpful thing, I think, for everyone.
Well, yeah, it is. But I'm going to read another quote now, because this is, again, just the way you can feel the disdain for the leftist dripping off the page, which a lot of people share. By feelings of inferiority, we mean not only inferiority feelings in the strict sense, but the whole spectrum of related traits. Low self-esteem, feelings of powerlessness, depressive tendencies, defeatism, guilt, self-hatred, etc. We argue that modern leftists tend to have such feelings, and these feelings are decisive in determining the direction of modern leftism. Obviously true. And so he says that the leftists they use the marginalized groups as a way of kind of ameliorating their own negative feelings about themselves, which, again, seems to be true.
I've got a lot to say about this, actually, in that I think some people may question, well, a lot of leftists don't really have the self-awareness to necessarily know that they're at the bottom of the hierarchy, but it's a very innately encoded biological thing. Like human beings are very social creatures, and social creatures have an intuitive sense of social hierarchy. And so even if they haven't, formally got a reasoning as to why they might be at the bottom of the hierarchy, they just have this feeling that they're not appreciated. And sometimes you can hear them explicitly say so, like, people treat me poorly, I'm not treated very well, I need to turn to politics, which is basically what weak people do if they're not being treated well by the people around them, is they start to use force, which politics is in a sense.
Well, it absolutely is. And there's a reason that there's a stereotype of what a male feminist looks like. Fat, greasy, balding, disgusting, wiry beard. Like, there's a reason, like, women aren't attracted to that person. They don't get dates. Okay, well, I need to do something to get around women. So of course you do, but,
It kind of ties into that hilarious phenomenon of all of the sort of 2015 feminists now have sort of archetypes of masculinity as their partners.
Yes.
Like big, hairy, muscly bikers and that sort of thing. It's like, well, this really doesn't mesh very well with what you're saying.
But he's got a great take here about these people. He says, those who are the most sensitive about politically incorrect terminology, again, they've been doing this for years, folks, are not the average black ghetto dweller, Asian immigrant, abused woman or disabled person, but a minority of activists, many of whom do not even belong to any oppressed group, but come from the privileged strata of society. Political correctness has its stronghold among university professors, who have secure employment with comfortable salaries, and the majority of whom are heterosexual white males from upper middle class families. Totally true. Totally true. It's true then as it is now.
Probably more true now, if anything, yeah.
Yeah, and so the problem with these, the sort of the bio-Leninist constituency that he's identified, the sort of spiteful mutants, as it were, who are resentful that they were not chosen by fate to be at the top of some hierarchy of some natural order, is that they hate strength. And this, I think, is a particularly cutting piece. He says, leftists tend to hate anything that is an image of being strong, good, and successful. They hate America, they hate Western civilization, they hate white males, they hate rationality. The reasons that leftists give for hating the West, etc., do not clearly correspond with their real motives. They say they hate the West because it is warlike, imperialistic, sexist, ethnocentric, and so forth. But where these same faults appear in socialist countries or in primitive cultures, the leftist finds excuses for them. Or at best, he grudgingly admits that they exist, whereas he enthusiastically points out and often greatly exaggerates these faults when they appear in Western civilization. Thus, it is clear that these faults are not the leftist's real motive for hating America and the West. He hates America and the West because they are strong and successful.
He is so spot on there. Yeah, and I think that
totally true.
The actual psychological mechanism going on here is that they have the emotions, the negative emotions first and foremost, and then they sort of come up with post hoc rationalizations after the fact for why they feel the way they do.
Yeah.
That is their attempt at understanding their unconscious reasoning, which, is difficult to a certain extent. Not everyone gets it right. But this is something that's rife amongst pretty much everyone, myself included. So I'm not necessarily, putting myself on a pedestal, but at least I know that it's possible to do that. And I think many people don't necessarily have the self-awareness to realise that maybe they're scapegoating their own feelings, because if they actually confronted why they felt the way they did, it would be too negative for them to actually cope with it. And they kind of intuitively shy away from negative emotion because they are cowards by sort of disposition.
Most people aren't prepared to look in the mirror.
Yes.
That's what it is. Jordan Peterson said that 95% of a person's personality is dead wood that needs to be burned off. They're not prepared to do that. They're not prepared to just strip down and go, okay, yeah, honestly, I need to change. I need to improve. No, instead, the entire world can change. It's the West that's evil. It's this fact that standards exist. It's not me failing the standards.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.